Elite Dangerous is often cited as being one of, if not the best VR games out there. Now, I've been saying for a while that I will be producing a video for the Oculus Rift S. Well, that video is finally here. So in this video I'm going to talk about both the Oculus Rift S itself, at least a little bit, and more specifically how it works and how it functions, and basically what you can expect from it with Elite Dangerous. In terms of the spec and performance of the Oculus Rift itself, you can check out my previous video, which is linked in both the video description as well as on the screen right now. But for those of you who don't really want to do that, I can also very briefly give an overview here. So one of the biggest changes between the Rift S and the original Rift is that the Rift S no longer requires a sensor setup, and this really is a huge improvement, as it means no awkward placing of remote sensors, and it also reduces cable management. The headset merely requires a single USB 3 port and one DisplayPort connection. Resolution is a little higher than the old Rift, coming in at 1280 by 1440 per eye, and the refresh rate is a little lower though, at 80Hz compared to the original 90Hz. So with that out of the way then, how does the headset perform with Elite Dangerous? Well, the first thing you'll notice is the significant reduction of the screen door effect. Whilst this was never massively apparent before now due to basically the game being set in space, i.e. most of the areas being black, it is very much improved with the Rift S. All the text within the game is now very easily to read as well, with only the smallest of the fonts still suffering from the blurriness. However, this isn't enough to prevent the text from being readable. The drop from 90 frames per second to 80 frames per second, thanks to the lower refresh rate, hasn't really made any noticeable difference, at least as far as I can see. And maintaining a high FPS though is always going to be an issue, and will be greatly dependent upon your hardware. For example, with my old GTX 980 Ti, FPS was never really a problem, at least when in space. However, when within stations or on planetary surfaces, there were stutters, as asynchronous time warp certainly kicked in. If low FPS or stutter or reprojection really doesn't bother you though, then I'm sure you'll be fine even with lower than 80 frames per second. If like me though, that you suffer from motion sickness, then this will certainly be an issue. Those of you though with more powerful hardware will have far less problems. My new RTX 2080 Super gave perfectly smooth performance regardless of the location within the game. However, all that said, from time to time the game did drop out for a few seconds, and I've been unable to track down what causes this. Basically the game freezes and a little hourglass comes up for less than a fraction of a second, but it is apparent, but it could be something to do with my setup. In short though, the main point here is that if Elite works great on your Rift, then the new Rift S doesn't place vastly more demands on your system. If you've never tried VR with your PC though, do keep in mind that it is hardware intensive. Now, Elite in VR is always an interesting one to talk about, and some people don't want to hear about the game, others just want to hear about the VR headset. So I feel it's safe to assume that I really don't need to review the game itself here, as at this point pretty much everyone watching will all have a good feel for the game. So in that case, let's talk about the benefits, if any, that the headset actually brings to the game. Now I'll start with one of the biggest issues I have with VR and Elite Dangerous, and that of course is travel times. Now I've mentioned many times before that I really dislike long travel times, and I'm fully aware that some of you actually like the long travel times for various reasons, including the fact that some believe it helps portray a sense of scale. It's also worth mentioning here that there are two different types of travel time: hyperspace jumps and supercruise. My biggest issue is with supercruise. Hyperspace travelled, well, it really isn't that bad. Now, while supercruise certainly it doesn't take many hours or anything like that, it nonetheless does take time. 10 minutes of supercruise can be frequent, and when on a monitor I usually alt-tab to something else, but when in VR this isn't possible unless you're willing to use overlays, which personally I'm not. What this results in is travel times where you have nothing to do other than to look out the windows of your ship, and in this case I feel VR highlights one of Elite's biggest problems. Beyond that though, VR adds immensely to Elite, and you've seen me doing various activities in the background here, including combat, mining, exploration and driving the SRV, and I'll talk about each of those in turn. So combat always is a great experience in VR. The added spatial awareness that you get from being placed inside the game provides a huge advantage, and I definitely found the Rift S to be improvement over the previous Rift here. The added resolution means that it's simply much easier to spot ships off in a distance, and whilst the resolution is still far from perfect, they are nonetheless much clearer to pick out against the background. Of course, throwing yourself around asteroids while fighting other ships is always going to be a fun use of VR, and I'd stress that this is one area where you will need top FPS performance. If you want to make the best of things with combat, it's better to have the hardware to support the experience. Mining, on the other hand, is a far more laid back experience, and you'll be able to get away with lower FPS here, at least for the most part, if that is something that you can live with. Now, deep core mining is particularly interesting, especially once the asteroid is cracked open. Flinging your ship around inside the core whilst picking up the valuable goods is certainly a lot of fun, and the added spatial awareness from VR helps keep it interesting. And yes, the explosions are also very good as well. Now, I do feel though that for mining in particular, the Rift S doesn't really bring anything new to the table when compared to the regular Rift. Both do the job just as well as each other. Exploration on the Rift S, however, is far more improved when compared to the previous Rift, especially when you look at the details on the planets, both from orbit as well as down on the surface. They really do stand out. Again though, flying over the surface will result in stutter and reprojection if you don't have the hardware for it. For example, on my old GTX 980 Ti, it just wasn't up to the job here. And flying over planets is one area where I found high frame rates to be essential. That said, some people really don't seem to notice low FPS when in VR, and this I think comes down to the reprojection technology. Head turning movements with the headset are always going to be very smooth thanks to this technology, and the FPS issues are instead apparent outside your ship as you see the landscape scroll by. So for me, anything less than 80 FPS in VR is very noticeable. However, your mileage will certainly vary. The Rift S for exploration is definitely a step up over the old Rift. The full spectrum scanner meanwhile remains a mess in VR, and I'm one of those people who actually enjoy using the FSS. However, within VR it's just not very good. As you can see, the UI hovers in front of you. It's surreal to say the least, and feels very out of place in VR, especially considering how good the rest of the game is in VR. That said, the Rift S definitely helps with the FSS as the text and tuning elements are much more readable. Overall then, I certainly feel that the Rift S is a big step up over the Rift when it comes to Elite. If you have the hardware to support it and want improved visuals, then the Rift S offers a nice improvement. Now, I haven't yet tried the Valve Index, however, and whilst that is a far more expensive option, it seems likely that it will be a far better visual experience. Bottom line then, the Rift S shows that Elite is still a great game in VR. It does highlight some of the game's flaws, however, but overall it's one of the best VR experiences out there. If you're new to VR and want to get a headset at a reasonable price, the Rift S is a good place to start. As an upgrade to the Rift, however, when it comes to Elite at least, there's a number of pros and cons, and it's certainly a huge improvement, but I'd still like to see a better resolution. The pros with the Rift S are that it's a better all-round experience in many regards for many elements of the game. The neutral side of it is that in some areas, like mining for example, there's not a huge difference between the Rift and the Rift S, at least in terms of the general day-to-day experience. The cons for the Rift S, the negative side, is pretty much the same for all VR headsets with Elite Dangerous. It just makes some of the grind and some of the travel times feel that much more excessive. Overall then, definitely recommend having the Rift S with Elite Dangerous. It's a big step up over the Rift, especially if you're already considering looking at another headset anyway. That then brings us to an end of this video. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.